mochurch.tv. Mochurch.tv, for those of you who are, like some are technically inclined, some are more technically declined, you might say. So if you're putting this on Facebook, don't forget the www dot, because that makes it a hyperlink that people can click on. And if you're watching online, we'd love for you to come join us. Come hang out with us. Meet some people that might be able to encourage you spiritually to move forward on your journey, searching for or following Jesus. So turn to John chapter 12 in a Bible app or in the house Bibles. That's page 873. Pass those down to your buddies trapped in the middle of the rows. Sometime around the turn of the millennium, when Y2K was a big scare, me and my wife were in our living room in a suburb of Northern Virginia. We were sitting on the couch together, and there was a game show on in the evening in the background. Now, I've never been really much of a game show person. It's not that I don't like them. I just try not to get hooked on them because there's plenty of other things that I do get hooked on. I'm like, game shows, they're one thing I can say no to. And it was back when, like, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire was huge. So I think it was Regis and Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And Shannon was kind of preoccupied with something on the couch. I was too, separately, but we're sitting there together. I think maybe she was flipping through a magazine. I was probably reading the scriptures, just doing something super deep and spiritual. And so we're both doing our own thing. And it got to a point in the show where they had 4 or 5 people on almost like a panel where they were going to present a dilemma or a puzzle that they had to solve, and whoever solved it the fastest would become the main contestant on, for instance, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And so they set the people out there right before they put out the topic that they will compete to solve this puzzle quickly. I kind of glanced up at the television and I said, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and I went back to whatever I was doing. And a couple seconds later, Reed just said, put these musical notes in the order that they belong. And all jumbled up were the notes, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And I snapped my head up and I was like, what? Did you hear that? I totally called that. And Shannon, not even looking up, was like, called what? And I was like, the thing, like, you love the sound of music. Didn't you just hear me say, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do? And then a couple seconds later, he was like, put these musical notes in order. I called that. And she was like, oh, yeah, I think I heard that. And I was like, no, I need you to have known. I need you to have heard this. I totally called that. I nailed that before he brought it up. This is incredible. Now, I need you to know this morning, Momentum. She didn't fully hear me or remember, but I need you to know. I need this. I called it before it happened. I spoke it as if I knew the future. It was unbelievable. And I'm telling you, I called it. And I need you to know that because it was one of the coolest moments of my life. It was just like, I said that. I spoke that before it happened. This was pre-children. We didn't have any kids yet. So those would eventually trump maybe that moment when we had children and all that. But for a brief moment, I felt like a prophet, man. And after that day, I really thought, like, dude, I could get out of the ministry. I was an associate minister. I could become a professional gambler. Like, just think about it. With this gift I suddenly have, I could become a professional gambler or a sorcerer. I mean, I could just become a seer, or even cooler yet, I could be a meteorologist. I mean, next level with this talent that I have. Well, the truth is, if I was a prophet, it was pure luck. And if I was a prophet, it was an accidental prophet. Totally by chance and by luck that I called that. Now, if you're here this morning, if you're not a Christian, let me break down for you. If you're not a follower of Jesus, a disciple of Jesus, a student of Jesus who follows him, maybe you used to be a church person, you stopped long ago, maybe you're kind of wandering back in, you're watching online, whatever. One of the things that baffles you about Christians, and it should, one of the things that you find very strange about us Christians, and you should, is that we Christians often resist the God that we say that we trust. Okay? Like, we resist the God that we say that we trust. In fact, let's just be honest here. We're in church this morning, so nobody should lie. But how many of you who are Christians would admit sometime in your life, maybe even in the last week, you've had an internal battle with God and found yourself resisting the very God that you say you trust? Anybody? I know I have. Okay? Can't lie. God's watching. He's listening. He's always there. And so some of you are in the middle of it right now. Like, maybe you're saying, man, I know that I should forgive, but it's hard to forgive. All right, some of you right now are saying, man, I know I should get out of this relationship, but there's something that I find fascinating, even addicting about this relationship that you're in, or I know I shouldn't go there, but I do it anyway. I know I shouldn't spend money in this way, but I do it anyway. I know I should be generous, but I'm not. And I know, but I find myself resisting the very God that I say that I trust. And your heart tells you what's right. Your conscience tells you what's right. The scriptures, when you read the scriptures, they tell you what's right. But a lot of times there are followers of Jesus who they struggle at times to kind of walk their talk. And most people at Momentum, because of our culture here, they own that. They're authentic about that and say, man, I do struggle with that. And they're not flippant, hopefully, like, yeah, I just totally resist God all the time. It's not that. It's saying, man, sometimes I do struggle with that. So if you're not a follower of Jesus, here's what I ask of you. Be a little bit merciful, okay? Cut us a little bit of slack, because it's really difficult to surrender your life to a God that you don't see. Okay? You're surrendering to a God who speaks into your conscience, who speaks through ancient literature, and it's very difficult to write the blank check of your life to a God that you've never seen. Now, this week we're starting a new series that's kind of on-ramping us and will include Easter, and it's about the weeks leading up to Jesus' crucifixion, his death, and his resurrection. And there's some characters whose lives intersected with Jesus as he's kind of making that walk toward the cross and eventually the empty tomb. And these characters each had a very specific agenda that put them at odds with God, specifically with Jesus. And I think that we're going to see in the series that there's a little bit of each of them inside of all of us. Like, man, as much as that person's a bad boy of Easter, I have to admit, there's a little bit of that person in me that I have to battle through. And these stories of resistance that we're going to talk about actually, I think, illustrate the futility of resisting God. That if you've been around for very long, if you've been following Jesus for any amount of time, your story of resistance, it's also an illustration of the futility of resisting God. All of us are illustrations of that in one way or another. And for those of us who are Christians, we know it doesn't make any sense to resist the God we say that we trust. But in the end, our resistance serves as an illustration to our children and to our grandchildren and to anybody watching. Man, they resisted in that season or because of that thing or because of that person. And it's ultimately shows, man, it's just futile to resist God. It's self-destructive in nature to resist God. And the first person we're going to talk about today is a guy named Joseph Caiaphas. He was the Jewish high priest from 18, no, there's not numbers missing there. This is the first century. From 18 to 36, Joseph Caiaphas. Most people just call him Caiaphas. That's how he's mentioned in Scripture in the first century. And Caiaphas was the high priest during the time when Jesus walked the earth as God in the flesh. And he was the most powerful, the most influential person in Jerusalem, in the broader region of Judea, and in what we would call ancient Israel. He was the most powerful dude among the Jews. And he was kind of the connecting point, if you will, between the nation of Israel and Rome. So the Roman Empire was ruling over several chunks of people, what used to be their own nations, and now they're ruling over all that. And it's the same with the Jewish people. They're being ruled over by the Romans. And so Caiaphas was the person who communicated with the Roman ruler Pilate, or whoever the leader of the Roman garrison was at any given time. And even more than that, and it's hard to describe the significance of this, Caiaphas was part of a family that controlled the temple. The one temple that existed and doesn't exist anymore in Jerusalem, and he controlled this family controlled the temple, the politics, the religion, the power of that temple, and his family controlled it for 40 years. So it was really like this dynasty because his father-in-law had been high priest at one time. 5 of his brothers-in-law had been high priest at one time. That's why I got this tattoo, just to remember that stat. And so all these people, they kind of were a dynasty. It's kind of like how Americans today gripe, and I think rightly so, that when it comes to election time, it's like we see the same last names pop up, like, here we go again. It's another Bush. It's another Clinton. Back in the day, it was a Kennedy, that kind of stuff. Like, man, does anybody else get into these ballots sometimes? It feels like that. And that is certainly probably the way some people felt then, because constantly the family from Caiaphas man, did they dominate. And they had all the power, all the influence, and they had extraordinary wealth. There were amazing financial perks that came with being the Jewish high priest in the Jewish religion in the first century. They got 10% off books at the Jewish bookstore. I mean, they got 10% off any drink they wanted at Hebrews coffee shop. See what I just, Hebrews? So yesterday, man, I'm already way off. Earlier practice service, it took a minute to get around to one of our Mo group members, Georgette, who like 5 seconds later guffawed in laughter in the front. I was like, boom, dad joke, nailed it, all right? It was awesome. So they're extremely wealthy when they're the high priest. And Jews all over the world, the reason for this, because Jews all over the world, no matter where they lived, they paid something called a temple tax. You didn't have to live in Jerusalem to pay this. Anywhere. And it was the equivalent of millions upon millions of dollars that flowed into a 32-acre piece of land in the middle of Jerusalem called the temple. And all this money flowed into Jerusalem. So much so that in history we find that because every Jew outside of Jerusalem paid this, people in different provinces, different governors in the Roman Empire would try to pass laws to say, hey, Caesar, can the Jewish people in our province not pay the temple tax? So much of our money is flowing out of our community or our state or our nation, whatever it is, because so much money was going to the temple. And that was just another thing. Caiaphas had extraordinary power, extraordinary influence, and extraordinary access to extraordinary wealth. I mean, he is a fat cat. So things went swimmingly for Caiaphas, the high priest, until a carpenter turned rabbi stepped into the pages of history. Now, I'm going to say today's sermon is a little bit different because the narrative today really is in the first century. We're going to follow a narrative, and I hope it's fascinating to you. Hopefully, if it's not, it'll be a little bit contagious because it's fascinating to me, and it'll rub off on you a little bit. But this guy steps onto history, a carpenter turned rabbi, and we know him as Jesus Josephson, okay? Now, you might glance at that and be like, what? Jesus Josephson? So many of you think that Jesus' last name was what? Christ, okay? But that is not a last name, okay? It is not a last name. That's what your grandfather yelled when he was doing carpentry out in the garage and he hit his thumb with a hammer, you know, and he called on the divine name of the divine carpenter. But that is not Jesus. It's not a last name, period. It's a title. And so Messiah was the way you said it in Hebrew, or Christ was the way you said it in Greek, and it meant the special anointed one sent by God who had been prophesied about for centuries. There will one day come a deliverer, a Messiah, who will set all things right for the Jewish people. And so Jesus was the Christ, and his last name really would have been like Joseph's son because he was son of Joseph. And that's the way that those last names typically would work. And so he'd be designated Jesus Joseph's son, or you might say Jesus of Nazareth to locate where he was from. And so I just kind of put it up there to create symmetry because I like order. Joseph Caiaphas, Jesus Josephson. Ta-da! Okay, so Jesus shows up, and here's the problem with Jesus, especially when related to Caiaphas. Jesus shows up, and some of his teachings were a problem to the religious leaders of that day, like Caiaphas. But the biggest problem to start off were the crowds. Like anywhere Jesus went, he drew huge, huge crowds. In fact, we see from the eyewitness accounts in the scripture called the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are gospel, good news accounts, eyewitness accounts of Jesus and his life and teachings. We hear eyewitnesses record that Jesus fed at a time 5,000 men, another time 4,000 men. And when people include, for the 5,000, when they include women and children, they're like, that was probably 10,000 people in the crowds that were there when Jesus performed a miracle where he multiplied loaves and fishes. So everywhere Jesus went, there were hundreds, often thousands of people that showed up, and that was a threat to the Roman Empire. Anytime crowds showed up, it made people a little jittery and nervous because crowds meant potential insurrection, division, and civil war. Anytime there was a crowd, it could turn bad quickly. They could turn on the Jewish leaders, or they could turn on the Roman garrison station there at the time. So crowds made people really nervous in an empire like this. And so The Romans were concerned about the crowds, and Caiaphas and his posse were therefore concerned about the crowds because they want to keep the peace with the Romans ruling over them. The Romans have the swords, all right? And so, like, we want to keep peace. Now, another problem Caiaphas had with Jesus was when Jesus spoke, he spoke with authority. And people noted it all the time. You don't teach like the other religious leaders do. He'd tell a story and make a point from it, and he seemed like he knew the God he was talking about. Like, yeah, so let me tell you the story about the Father. Like, wait a minute, your Father? What do you mean, the Father? Like, what? And so he just spoke with such authority. In fact, one time he went into the temple in Jerusalem. He went off. He kicked over some tables. He started a mosh pit in there. He started letting all these animals go, doves fly away. It was like a Prince movie music video. And so all this stuff starts happening. He's knocking stuff over because these money changers are ripping people off so they have to pay certain amounts of money for these animal sacrifices. Jesus goes off because of the injustice. He knocks stuff over. He creates a ruckus. Well, word gets back to Caiaphas and the religious leaders, and they send someone to go inquire of Jesus. Religious hoity-toities show up, pinky sticking out. They're sipping on communion or whatever, And they come and they start to ask Jesus questions, and they ask the right question. They don't come to Jesus and say, "What do you think you're doing?" They come to Jesus and essentially say, "Who do you think you are?" Right? Like the authority of Jesus. Who does he think he is? Wait a minute. He isn't blaspheming. He isn't offending God by saying he's the Son of God, is he? And he spoke with so much authority, and that was something that wasn't good for the religious leaders. One more problem they had with Jesus was this. He was extraordinarily critical of the Jewish religious leaders. Now, if you want to read a Jesus rant, it'll be fun for you. Today at lunch or after lunch, bust open a Bible app or a Bible and go to Matthew 23. The heading should be a rant by our Savior, Jesus. Because he just rants in this chapter. He rails on the temple leaders with no respect. He doesn't hold anything back because the corruption that was going on in the temple system and in the religious order of that time, when he showed up in history, it drove him insane, and he was all about criticizing it. And so he would go at the jugular of religious people, but yet he hung out with prostitutes and crooks, and he vibed with them. They were gelling like Magellan with Jesus. They were hanging out with him. They were having dinner. But the religious leaders, it was always bumping heads, and he was very critical of them, and he would rant. So in the middle of this rant in Matthew 23, including Caiaphas the high priest, here's what he says. He says, "You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell?" Woo! Jesus doesn't pull the hell card on prostitutes and crooks, but he's looking at the religious leaders, and he's telling, these are the guys who get up in the morning to help people, to lead them to God, to help people make their animal sacrifices to God, who get up in the morning thinking, we're the best of the best of the best, men in black. We're the best of the best of the best. And they show up, and Jesus criticizes them and says, you're all going to hell. What? And Jesus doesn't pull that card very often, and when he does, he pulls it with the religious leaders. I mean, you wouldn't let your kids talk like that. Jesus is talking to the respected religious leaders, the good guys of the first century, and he's throwing it at them like that. And it's no wonder that Caiaphas had a little bit of problem with Jesus and his authority and the crowds and all this that was going on and the criticism that Caiaphas dealt with coming from the mouth of Jesus. So Jesus threatened the peace and the peacemakers in Jerusalem and in all of essentially Israel. This builds and builds. You've got to read the Gospels. This plot builds and builds throughout each gospel, coming to the point of the crucifixion and the resurrection. You've got to read it. And there's one final straw. It's not something Jesus said. It's something he did. It wasn't a conversation or a confrontation. It was an act of compassion. And this final straw is Jesus raised someone from the dead. This is the pinnacle. If you're like, whoa, yes, to them too. Okay, this is the pinnacle of all of his miracles. He raises a dude who's his own friend from the dead. He's from a town called Bethany, this guy is. His name was Lazarus. And Bethany is kind of like a suburb of Jerusalem. It's like 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. And it's the pinnacle of his miracles. So Lazarus had not only died, but he had been buried. He's in the tomb, and Jesus shows up kind of late to the party, according to the people that wanted Jesus to heal Lazarus when he was still alive and sick. And the next thing you know, it's like a Michael Jackson Thriller music video up in there, and Lazarus is coming out of the tomb, taking off mummy clothes and stanking and stuff like that. And people are like, what? And it was so over the top that the crowds swelled and swelled and swelled. And the religious leaders, Caiaphas in particular, realized that their strategy is failing. Their strategy up to this point, you see it throughout the Gospels, their strategy at this point was to discredit Jesus publicly. They would show up and in front of the crowds ask him really difficult questions, and they would try to stump him and make him look bad in front of the crowd, ask him some things that he doesn't have the answer to, give him some moral dilemmas, see how he handles those. But just time after time again, they'd lob up these really tough questions or pitch in a quick fastball, and Jesus would just crank them out of the park with some incredible answer, and the crowds again would be like, go Jesus! And they'd be like, dang it, again! And the crowds continue to stick to him, and what they had hoped was to discredit Jesus in front of the crowds, to divide him from the crowds. They wanted Jesus to lose the crowds, because once Jesus lost the crowd, he would no longer be a threat to the peace that they had established with Rome. So after Lazarus was raised from the dead, here's what John, one of the people who was an eyewitness to these events, said. He said, now, the crowd that was with Jesus when he called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. So the people that were there and had mourned at the funeral saw that Lazarus was dead. Then Jesus shows up 4 days later. He got da-doom, doom, 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 da-doom. And as they see it all, they start spreading the word. And it says next, many people, because they had heard that he had performed this sign, went out to meet him. So first you had a crowd. Now you've got an even bigger crowd. People are showing up in Bethany, right outside of Jerusalem, to see Jesus who raised Lazarus from the dead, to see Lazarus because he had been raised from the dead. And the leaders in the temple, just a couple miles away, are throwing up their hands thinking, how is this ever going to end? What is going to put a stop to this? So it says, so the Pharisees said to one another, the Pharisees were like a denomination. They weren't just leaders. It was like a denomination of the Jewish religion. The Pharisees said to one another, see, this is getting us nowhere. What? Our current strategy, trying to stump them in front of crowds. Look how the whole world has gone after him. Now, this is kind of fascinating right here, okay? Fast forward to the book of Acts. This is after those gospel accounts, those separate eyewitness accounts, 4 of them, that lead through the resurrection of Jesus. Next is kind of the next step in the narrative is the church after the resurrection of Jesus. And one of the things we find out in the book of Acts, written by Luke, Luke wrote one of the Gospels, and then Luke part 2 is the book of Acts. And one of the things that Luke mentions is that many priests and Pharisees become followers of Jesus after the resurrection. So somewhere in this history, a bunch of these people who kind of used to be the bad guys, they become followers of Jesus, and there's a whole bunch of them. And this is so important. This is how John, for instance, and Luke have the inside track as you read through the Gospels about what the religious leaders are saying together. When they're whispering about how to deal with Jesus, what are we going to do about him? This is how he's ticking us off. They know because some of the guys in those meetings later became followers of Jesus. And Luke says at the beginning of his gospel, I have thoroughly investigated this. The life and teachings of Jesus, he's a physician. He's an educated man. He's like, I have thoroughly researched this. And here's what I found. So Luke and John later know the stories of these guys who used to be in the huddles of religious leaders. And they probably told them stories like, you wouldn't have believed some of the meetings that we had about Jesus before we followed him. Like, you just wouldn't even believe. I mean, we were so frustrated. No matter what we did, Jesus made us look like an idiot. And we'd huddle up together and we'd have conversations about it. And one of the things they told John was, in one of our meetings, we said this, look at how the whole world is going after him. He raised Lazarus from the dead. The crowds are swelling even more. Look how the whole world's going. And I bet one of those religious leaders who's now a Christian probably laughed about it. And I mean, laughed at himself. Like, I can't believe how much Jesus was perplexing us and ticking us off. And surely he laughed out loud about it. And if you think their whole world was, if they thought their whole world went after Jesus then, I mean, fast forward to now. Now, 1/3 of the planet says Jesus is someone really, really special. Like God in the flesh special when he came to earth. 1/3 of the world proclaims, I think that Jesus is Lord, that he is God. And that's 1/3 of the world. So, I mean, they didn't even know what they were on the front end of to say, man, look, the whole world's going after him. I mean, look what has become of the Jesus movement that they had no idea they were on the front end of. Well, immediately after Lazarus was raised from the dead, there was another conversation that went like this, and John records it in his eyewitness account and from testimonies of people who later became Christians. He said this, then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. Now, this means almost nothing to us, but the Sanhedrin was the Jewish high council of that time, and it included 3 groups as teachers of the law, Pharisees, Sadducees. There's a little bit of overlap in there, but mostly they're separate groups. And there are 3 groups that didn't like each other. They couldn't agree on stuff theologically about beliefs in God. Sadducees believed that there was no resurrection, meaning no afterlife. The Pharisees believed there was. And so the Pharisees are like, he said we're going to hell. The Sadducees are like, there's no hell, okay? So they're arguing about that kind of stuff. And they didn't agree politically. Like, for instance, they couldn't agree on how Israel should deal with Rome and interact with Rome. And so these guys don't agree with anything. This would be like the House and the Senate, the Republicans and the Democrats and the Supreme Court all coming together and agreeing on something, okay? Just let that sink in, okay? Reds and blues and all that, let it sink in. Okay, that's what it was like. That's how big of a threat they saw Jesus as. These 3 groups got together in the Sanhedrin, the high ruling council, and they agreed on something. And they said this together. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. They'll say, you guys can't control the peace. The crowds keep swelling. This Jesus guy's out of control. We're coming in heavy-handed now. We're going to take that away from you. And so they're like, man, if we don't do something, we're going to lose everything that's important to us. And this is bad news. And this is where it gets really relevant. This is where it gets really practical. This is where it really gets, just really, just super, super real, is to embrace Jesus and who he claimed to be meant that they would have to let go of something that was extraordinarily important to them. Power, popularity, wealth. And we know that eventually some of them did eventually. But right now in this moment, as they're wrestling with who's this Jesus, and we've heard him talk and we've seen him perform even some miracles, they knew what they needed to do, but the bottom line is it just cost too much. They wanted to preserve their temple and their positions and their wealth and all this. And this is the case today. When you decide to follow Jesus, I can't say it enough, it's going to cost you something. It always, always does. And if you are a Christian, here's another big point is from season to season, as you follow Jesus, sometimes other shiny things are going to pop up in your life. Sometimes it'll be a shiny person, okay? It'll be different things that pop up. And it's going to be something that maybe for a time becomes more important to you than your relationship with God. And some people walk away from Jesus in those moments. But then there's other people who are like, no, I'm going to get Jesus back to the front and center of my life. I've let this thing take over. And when you do that, it's going to cost you something. It always costs something to follow Jesus. And let's be honest, let's put this at a really base level. This is the reason some of you would admit you resisted church for so long, okay? Because it starts with one really simple fact, and that is, if I start going to church, that means I got to give up my Sunday mornings, all right? So if you're Catholic, Saturday evening, Saturday afternoon, whatever, it's still weekend, okay? But for instance, Momentum, most Protestant-type churches are Sunday morning, and the reason you resisted church so long, and I want you to understand, I get this. I was a man before I was a preacher, okay? Like, I totally get. Like, that's a sacrifice to say, I'm going to show up and I'm going to give up my Sunday mornings. But this is an example at the base level. One of the reasons people resist church is because they feel like, man, I got to give up my Sunday mornings now. You know, like I have to give up the pregame show, okay, as if the material, and I love football, as if the material isn't just looped over and over, like the same. We're talking about the same injury. This is the 5th time we've talked about the same injury before this NFL game, you know. And so, but I know I got to give up the pregame show. I got to give up sleeping in. That would be my biggest one. I want to stay up very late on Saturday and play shooter games and watch Netflix with my wife and all that stuff. But you got to give up sleeping in, or maybe it's, you know, newspaper and coffee for you. Other people are like, yeah, if you're 50 or over. But, you know, newspaper and coffee, it might be the plain deal. Or it might be you have to give up or come back early from a camping trip, right? Now we're getting real because we're in Ohio, people. You're like, we have 3 nice months. All I want to do is go camping over the weekend and stay gone. But as soon as you're like, man, I think I'm going to become a follower of Jesus, I think I'm going to investigate that. But I got to give up my Sunday mornings or be back by Sunday morning. I just don't know. And then your wife starts going to church and your kids start loving church and this stuff starts going on. Next thing you know, you're here and you're like, dang it. Now eventually one day the church is going to want my money. They're talking about buying facilities. That's going to cost me something, you know? Or, you know, next thing you know, the church is going to ask me to volunteer. Like, when does it end? And so you resist showing up on Sunday morning. You say, I don't even want a part of that. And I get it. And that's just an example of how following Jesus is going to cost you something, but it's at every step of the way. There's always something new, shiny popping up that you're like, maybe I'll make my whole life about that. That's always popping up. Maybe I'm going to go after this goal. Maybe I want to be in this relationship. The person ain't bad, but the relationship is bad. It's toxic. Maybe I'll make this the thing. And it's always going to pop up. Students, this is why some of you have stopped going to Unleashed, our student ministry, because there's points in the small groups where you get to this point of discussion, which we do in all of our Mo groups, where we talk about action steps. What does the scripture mean to your life? What are you going to do about it? How are you going to put it into an action step? And when you talk about action steps, that's when you're talking about taking steps forward to follow Jesus. And it always costs you something. And so some people eventually got to the point of like, man, I'm just silent in those action step parts of the discussion, and it always costs something to follow Jesus. Or maybe you're single, you're like, I just want to be clear, I don't think God's plan for everybody is to couple up. You know, but if you're single, the truth is, some of you are like, man, can't I just wait until I'm married to then follow Jesus? Because it costs you something to be single and follow Jesus in this culture and in this society. It's always going to cost something. You're like, man, if I'm a single person who follows Jesus, I'm probably have to date Christians, you know? And these are some of your thoughts, not mine. And like, there are totally no hot Christians to date. I mean, how many hot Christians are? How many hot Christian dudes are there? How many hot Christian chicks are there? Like, almost none. You know, these are your thoughts, not mine, okay? I disagree. There's a lot of hot Christians, all right? I'm married, so I only think there's one. So, you know, but like, man, I would have to sacrifice something. That's just the truth. That's just the truth. To be single in our culture and to say Jesus is Lord, leader of my life, it's always going to cost something. So often, we know what we need to do, but the price is just too high. And we say, like the religious leaders, the Sanhedrin, Caiaphas, that's the tension they're in right there. When it comes to the price of following Jesus, there's a tension that comes with it. And we are all either in it right now or just got out of it, or we're a week away from wrestling with it again. Because Jesus has to stay front and center when you follow Jesus, and that's a struggle spiritually all the time. Sometimes you find yourself resisting the very God that you say you trust. And so back in the first century, they were saying, what do we do with Jesus? Everybody's following Jesus. The whole world's going after Jesus. Now he raised a dude from the dead, and people can talk to that dude. They can interview Lazarus and his sisters, the people that were at the funeral. Here's a clue. If someone raises someone from the dead, follow him. Get in line behind that guy, okay? Just starting there. Just get in line. But the stuff that had become life to these religious leaders, center of their gravity, so important, so precious to them, the thought of giving it up, they just couldn't do it. And finally, we hear from the voice of the bad boy named Caiaphas in this Easter story, and that is this. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, spoke up, and he said to the rest of the Sanhedrin, "You know nothing at all," he says. And he goes on to say this, "Do you not realize that it's better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish?" Think about what he just said there. He says, guys, quit trying to trip them up with questions. Our strategy wasn't working. Quit trying to separate them from the crowds. This isn't rocket scientists. We got to get rid of one man and problem solved. If we get rid of this one man, we will be fine. Our positions will be, our whole nation. That's what I mean. We're talking about the nation, protecting the nation here, right? The people. Our whole nation will be fine if we just get rid of one dude. This is Caiaphas's "who wants to be a millionaire" moment. He doesn't mean to call it, but this is an accidental, unintentional prophet. He says, all we need is one man to die for all the people. And he has no idea what he's calling right here, moments before it happens. And John, who writes this gospel, is an old man when he writes it. Several years have passed since he experienced these things. And John writes in his gospel at this point, right here. This is so powerful. He says this, "Caiaphas did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together, make them one. And from that day on, they plotted to take his life." Wow. Now, John is looking back at this. He's probably smiling as he's writing this, just because thinking they plotted to destroy Jesus. They plotted to take the life of God in the flesh. They plotted against him. He's probably grinning, because he knows the ending. He's like grinning about this as he writes this. Little did they know that as they resisted Jesus, they were actually participating in God's will, who sent Jesus so that he could die, and they resist Jesus. They're actually facilitating the will of God, and it would be demonstrated by the coming events. And in the end, Jesus' death actually multiplied his influence, and that's why I said up front, at the end of my life, at the end of your life, man, ultimately, our lives illustrate the futility of resisting God, that we will be illustrations of people who either said yes, even though it's going to cost me, or no, because I think it costs too much. And we're going to see, looking back, the futility in our lives of times we resisted God and it actually just hurt us. It ended up being self-destructive. And in the end, that's what is illustrated by our resisting God. And here's why. Because you were not created for your own glory. There are going to be hearts in this room and online who resist this. You were not created for your own glory. You were created for God's glory. So ultimately, God is going to get glory from your life, whether it's through your submission or even through your choice, because you have the choice to resist him. But God is still going to find a way to use your story, even if you resist him, to his glory in some way and redeem those moments and those bad choices for his glory, even though it's for your own self-destruction. So John writes this down. He says this, "So from that day on, they plotted to take his life." John had to be grinning. Just the fact that they thought they could take his life. Like just a couple chapters previous in John 10, Jesus is talking, and John writes down that Jesus said, "The reason my Father loves me is that I laid down my life, only to take it up again." And he goes on to say even more explicitly, "No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again." Dang, that gives me goosebumps. He's like, nobody's going to take my life. I'm going to choose to lay down my life for all the people. And then I have the authority to choose to take it up again. And John must have just been grinning about this idea of them taking Jesus' life. But Caiaphas had a problem, and the problem was simply this. As the Jewish high priest, who's not a Roman ruler, he cannot put Jesus to death for what he deems as a religious crime, blasphemy, even though the Jews say you can stone someone to death. Well, yeah, back before the Romans were around, you could stone someone to death for, and I mean like not, but that, okay? So you could stone someone to death for blasphemy. You could do that. But now the Romans are in charge, so he needs something stronger to stick. He has to go to the Romans and say, Jesus hasn't committed just a Jewish crime. He's committed a Roman crime. And so what he has to do is get the charges to stick to Jesus of sedition. He had to prove that Jesus posed a threat to the Roman Empire. Jesus claimed to be king, and that's all that Caiaphas needed. Jesus kept talking about his kingdom, people being a part of his kingdom, so that's what Caiaphas needed. So he pegged Jesus with the charge of sedition because he claimed to be king, and he asked the Romans to crucify Jesus. And when Jesus died, the Jewish leaders thought the threat had been eliminated. Their position in the city and their nation, that it was secure. That's what they thought. But the sun rose first day of the week, and I picture that there was a commotion outside of Caiaphas' home, and I picture there were footsteps running through the hallway, and someone burst in his door, and they said, "Sir, the body of the Jewish rabbi that we had crucified is missing." And I picture Caiaphas saying to him, "What do you mean missing?" And rumor begins to spread throughout Jerusalem and beyond that reports that Jesus has been sighted around the vicinity. And a few days later, Jesus' followers would come out of hiding as they were for a few days, scared for their life that the Romans were going to come for them next. Suddenly, the disciples come out and they're prancing around the streets of Jerusalem, and they're saying publicly to people and to the religious leaders, "You crucified him. God raised him. We've seen him alive with our own eyes. About 500 people have seen him. Interview us, any of us you want to, but you need to tell God you're sorry," is basically their message. And this begins to spread. And this is what's so amazing about this is now suddenly crowds of people are rallying to the name of Jesus, to the resurrection of Jesus. Crowds are still a problem, but now it's simply the name of Jesus being preached, and the fact that people are saying he raised from the dead and we saw him, we touched him, we heard from him. And years later, Caiaphas, of course, would realize that Jesus would do more in his dying than he did in his living, and that they weren't able to take his life. It just continued to spread till a third of the world today says Jesus is Lord. And years later, Caiaphas lost his place, and the Jewish people lost their temple. And as it would happen time and time and time again with people like Caiaphas and his cronies and others around him, they all become a footnote in the life of Jesus Josephson of Nazareth. That's what comes down to. Now, what does this mean to you and me? Let me bring it home. Let me land the plane. As a couple of you who aren't fascinated with this history are like, please land the plane, okay? So here we go. What does it mean to you and me? Everything. Because all of us have a little bit of Caiaphas inside of us. We got this little Caiaphas who just rears his head at times. And basically the idea is there's a little Caiaphas in me that says preserve at all costs. Preserve, 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 preserve. Fight for what you have. Protect. Whether it's reputation, preserve at all costs. Whether it's a relationship that you know you should not be in. But man, it means so much to you right now that you do anything to preserve it, and you find yourself thinking, God, help me with this relationship. Help me get or keep this person, but don't get in my way, God. Get out of my way. Like, I want this so badly. And some of you have things that you would say to God, help me maintain or preserve this thing. Don't take it away from me, God. If you take this away from me, if you try, I'm done with you. Because it's all about that thing. It's all about that person. Preserve your GPA. Even if it means I got to cheat to keep it. Preserve your GPA. So it's preserve, preserve, preserve. And I want you to hear one thing. So if I'm losing you, tune back in for just a second because this is really important. Whatever you have replaced God with in your life, it's already diminishing in value and significance. Because people who have walked this path for a long time can look back and say, that thing that I was making God in my life, it's not even here anymore. That person's gone now. Or that thing that I chased so hard, it's disappeared. A lot of your greatest regrets, and my greatest regrets, are connected to your attempts to preserve something or someone that probably isn't even a part of your life anymore. Think about that. The thing or that person was losing its significance even as you were clutching onto it with white knuckles. And this is the case with Caiaphas. The fuse had already been lit. His position, influence, power, he was losing all that significance more and more every day, and he never knew it until it was completely gone. Here's the deal. The little gods, the things that you make a god will always, always, always disappoint. The thing that you place in your life at center instead of Jesus, it will always disappoint you. The pressure to preserve and to prop that little god up eventually becomes self-destructive. But on the other hand, God's saying, I have a better plan for your life, and you get to make the choices. I give you that option, but I have a plan for your life, a will for your life. And if you put anything else at the center of your life other than your Creator, it sets you up for self-destructive behavior that hurts you and hurts people around you. This is why some of your greatest regrets are connected to a season of your life, a weekend, a relationship, where you tried to prop up something that would be at the center instead of Jesus. The little gods always, always, always disappoint. And I just want to say as a side note, high school students and middle school students, like if you're there, I sincerely want to say to you, there are people in the room of older generations who are thinking of you right now, their kids, their grandkids, thinking you have a chance to get this right, to make Jesus number one and to not put any other thing, any other goal, any other person, any other thing there in the center of your life, because there's these older adults in the room who are saying, amen, amen. Like, do you know how badly some of these people wish they could go back and be 16 again? Not because they just, want to relive the glory days and have also iTunes and online gaming and those things that you have that we didn't have. I mean, we're not bitter or anything, but, it's not just because they want to go back and do that, but really because there's something they put at the center of their life instead of Jesus that they look back at one point and said, man, that hurt me for so long because I was resisting God and it was futile. I hope the next generation is listening. You have a chance to get this right because the little gods are always, always, always going to disappoint. And the little gods are always, always, always going to disappear. They're eventually going to be gone. And so I totally understand why Christians resist the God that we say we trust. And this is the bottom line. Because surrender is terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. And if it isn't terrifying to you, either you are a giant of the faith or you're just a big liar, because surrender is terrifying. And there's seasons where you re-up over and over. But the story of Caiaphas reminds us of something that we better not forget, and that's this. Saying yes to God will cost you something, but saying no will cost you even more. It will cost you so much more. And some people in this room have learned from that and said, man, over the years, I've caught on to that. Here's the kicker. Saying no will cost you so much more, often including the very thing or person you were holding on to so tightly. It will cost you that too. And so here's my closing question. What have you put in the place of God in your life? What is dead center other than Jesus? What are you seeking to preserve and prop up that actually needs to be surrendered? Say, God, I give this to you, and I put you ahead of this thing. What's the little God that's demanding more and more, but providing less and less? That's often the case. It's demanding more and more, but it's giving you less and less. Saying yes to God, it'll cost you everything, but saying no will cost you more, including what you replace God with to begin with. That's the lesson from Caiaphas, bad boy of Easter.